I really like it. I like Tony Kushner as a writer.
Yeah.
The fact that it feels so natural. Wow, you got bright. The fact
opened up a Word document.
Word.
Hello and welcome to Story Weavers, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything story related.
Here, we'll delve into inspiration, plot, structure, character, and dialogue. Be it in books, movies, music, comics, television, or anything else, we'll be covering it from conception to reception.
We'll be discussing between ourselves as well as with other creators and fans about their experiences, routines, and techniques. Join us and find your next inspiration. We're your hosts, Dean Bradley
and John William Worth.
And this is Story Weavers.
Yes, which is our first book of the month. It's the Splendid and the Vile by Erik Larson, a really fantastic nonfiction writer with another really fantastic nonfiction book. Yes. This time about Winston Churchill's early years as prime minister in the early days of World War II. I forget, was this his second term as prime minister or first? First, okay. Because he served a position in the British government before it, but I wasn't sure if he was prime minister or
captain
military.
of the Admiralty, I think?
I think so, yeah.
And and there was a blunder, and he got taken back down, or he got taken down, and I mean, blacklisted is not the right word, but people, including Lord Halifax and and a lot of the Labour Party held that against him and over his head when he was, in his early days as prime minister, or even taking on the position as prime minister.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for those of you who have not read this book, it was our book of the month. Just a brief overview of Erik Larson, I guess, is probably the best way to start this. Mm-hmm. So Erik Larson is a New York Times bestselling author of nonfiction. The majority of his works, at least all the ones I've read, and I think all the ones that have made the bestseller list, are all non-fictional accounts of specific events in history. Mm-hmm. And his writing includes lots of quotes, either for someone speaking, or it's noted in the introduction of all of his books that any segment with quotes is a direct quote from some documented source from the time of the event, whether it's a newspaper article, whether it's a journal, whether it was a speech or a video or whatever it was. So that's one of the really interesting things about Erik Larson, and one of the things that makes his book so interesting to read is not only is it nonfiction, he tries to make it as accurate as possible, and it reads like a story. A lot of them read, I mean, not a thriller necessarily, but a lot of them, they read like a story. There's some sort of narrative and connectivity.
I mean, I'll definitely second that, because I've read, out of the books he's written, I've read In the Garden of Beasts.
That's the other one I've read.
The Devil in the White City, which I absolutely loved, and Dead Wake. And the last two, Devil in the White City, about the Chicago World Fair and America's first serial killer, H.H. Holmes, and then Dead Wake, which is about the sinking of the Lusitania. Those both very much read like thrillers.
Yes, I haven't read those yet, but that's what I've heard.
They're very, especially Dead Wake. I mean, it's very clear that is like prime real estate for thriller material. It's like you have this big, huge incident at the end that you know is coming, and it's like the way he constructs the narrative, I say, is just, in those two books, so ingenious, and you can see that in all of his work, to varying degrees of success, I would say.
Yeah. But no, I mean, he does a good job at finding a way to take the narratives or the segments of history that we have access to, and still managing to put like minor cliffhangers at the ends of some chapters, even if you know what the end of the book is going to be, and we know what's going to happen because it's history, and a lot of them are major historical events that we all at least learned something of at some point, probably in our secondary education. As my dogs start barking, hold on.
Yeah.
Give me one sec. Keep recording, but let me go close that door over there because they're all barking.
Go ahead.
Someone
I will
home.
still be recording.
All right.
I'll be here.
If you had been talking, it wouldn't have been an issue, but I was in the middle of talking.
It was just at the end of one of, I think you just finished, and it's like you were talking about, what were you saying? Like constructing, how he leaves off at the end of chapters, like little cliffhangers, like little hooks to bring you in. And it's, it's like he definitely escalates the tension as the book goes on, because you can see like the events start to happen a little faster. The beginning is very much character centric. Pretty much almost, I don't want to say nothing happens in the beginning of the book, but you're getting to know the characters, which is something else I found very interesting. He treated these major historical people as characters, like it's like, oh yeah, you need to be introduced to Hitler. Like it's like he treated it very much like a fiction narrative. Like you have no idea what's going on, but you do.
Yeah, a lot of nonfiction text doesn't get into that either. A lot of times they'll have some sort of character bio. People normally said this about him, la-di-da, but because of the style of Erik Larson's text, you get inner thoughts from journals, and you get day-to-day interactions. And one of the really, really cool things about The Splendid and the Vile is Churchill himself, and not just as a character or a personality, but that basically at all times when Churchill was working, someone was writing it down. Someone was writing down what he said. He had a stenographer everywhere he went, in bed, late at night.
Taking a bath.
Taking a bath, yeah. So not only do we have his speeches and what other people may have written about him in the press, but we actually have what we can mostly assume is word for word text of what Churchill was saying during meetings or during thinking about policy or how to attack a certain issue, which is very unique when it comes to looking at a historical figure. Right.
I mean, you're dealing with Churchill, who, like you said, everything about him was written down, but also the fact that all of these characters, pretty much all of them, had journals. So not only, because Churchill was obviously a very public figure, and anyone can tell you what Churchill acted like and what he looked like and the kind of personality he had. But then you read his journals and you might hear from people who were very close to him, like the guy who was his friend, the guy he promoted to
the Beaverbrook.
Yes. And it's like they knew sides of Churchill that other people didn't. So it's like, even though you're seeing the very public image of a very public man, like he was just always turned on, always turned up to 11, those other asides from those other characters gave you a glimpse into, okay, Churchill's weaknesses, Churchill's like fears, because he had them. And that's another thing I liked about this book, how you were mentioning it also. Other adaptations of events around Churchill or other depictions of him, as wonderful as they are, they're very caricaturish at times.
At least on film.
Exactly. But even some books too, like if he's a background character or a supporting character, it's like, it's reliant on the fact that, you know who Churchill is. It's like, this book doesn't have any
preconceptions
of it. It's like, this is who he is, and it introduces him to you fresh. And it was very refreshing, actually, to see something like that, because it's like it made him and everyone around him much more human, warts and all.
Yeah, and he and because of this, he is able to write it in the form of an objective narrator, basically. So he's telling this story, but anything that basically gives hint or rise to emotions or how someone reacted, or anything like that, it's all documented somewhere, and if it's not, he says it. He will say outright whether it's something that's open for debate or something we're not sure about, and sometimes offers opinions one way or the other. But for the most part, he's an objective narrator telling the story of people during war. I mean, basically, that was a really crappy way to end that train of thought, but
it just derailed very slowly. No, I like how you said like he's as objective a narrator as you can get, which in nonfiction you want to be, and even in fiction, that's what's expected. It's like you're letting the characters speak for you, except here they're not characters, they're real people. The one thing I will say about having a fiction depiction of a nonfiction narrative, say that 5 times fast.
Fiction depiction of a nonfiction narrative. Fiction depiction of a nonfiction narrative. No, I'll stop it too.
Is that at several, I dare you, at several points, like it does kind of flag. Like it's not particularly noticeable. Like I'm reading The Wheel of Time right now. It's a very long-winded process, and there are points there where it's like it feels like a tarp just kind of like dipping down. Like you can feel the narrative kind of weighing it down and like okay, slowing. This, it was more like in little spikes.
Well, part of that too is just, you know, when you're
the way it is.
When
it's
you're writing writing history. I mean, it's almost like writing a fantasy novel, whether you're talking Lord of the Rings or you're talking Game of Thrones or anything like that. You're taking characters and perspectives from multiple different locations that all have different perspectives of what are going on, and you're trying to weave them into some sort of coherent thought that people can follow. And a lot of times the way he sets it up, sometimes it can be difficult to figure out when exactly things are taking place, because you'll jump from, you know, one of Churchill's daughters, you know, walking around the grounds having a happy summer day, and then it goes to, you know, Churchill at 10 Downing doing something, and then it goes to Goring, you know.
And it will go to Hess preparing his flight, which I like how he peppered that throughout the narrative.
That was cool, yeah.
But
he just kind of jumps all over the place, and he goes, you know, sometimes there will be a chapter that's like mainly focused on like the romance of some characters, or some that are focused on this, but a lot of times it does kind of just like jump around between this. Oh, at this time, this person was doing something romantic, and at the same time, this person was doing this. So in that sense, I definitely think it can be a little jarring.
Yeah, but there's nothing you can do about that. It's like, it's one of those things as the reader you have to accept, and I do it in my narratives too, and I feel like it's generally frowned upon. Like there should be a reason why you jump to a different perspective all of a sudden. And it's like, well, yeah, because it becomes important later on. Like throughout this narrative, I was like, why do we keep looking at Hess preparing for this flight? Why do we keep coming back to that? Especially since the guy fails many, many times. But it all kind of ties in at the end, and it's like everything in there serves a very specific purpose. It's not there. Right. There's some things there for window dressing, but you can tell when they're there for window dressing. Like the one detail, for some reason I remember, because this is a tidbit from when I was younger, when he mentioned the book "And Then There Were None" towards the end. Yeah. I remember that. And that's like one of the things also I feel like Erik Larson kind of broke the fourth wall to an extent and did give his opinion. Yes. I mean, completely understandably on the original title of that book. But it's like that's very obviously window dressing. It also places the story in a time, you know, in a time period, which obviously it is. But it's I have to marvel at the construction of the book, but I can still criticize it.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Everything is worth criticizing.
Oh yeah, but then the other big thing I started noticing as the book went on, which was something I started paying a special attention to, maybe wrongly, but how like midway through the book when the bombings began to, spoiler alert by the way, when the bombings on London started increasing, especially on I forget the name of the town, was it Dover? I think.
Anyways.
Yeah. Anyway, so they
bombing a town outside of London.
Yes, they completely destroyed it, and that's really where the book kind of reminds you, oh, by the way, this is about Londoners as well, not just about these powerful political figures, because up until that point, like the 250, 300 page mark, it felt like the war was completely left out and completely like ignored.
Oh, yeah.
And then all of a sudden it was brought back down, and from that point onward, I started noticing maybe Larson was doing this on purpose, but the Churchill family, you know, they were able to get food that not many other people could. The daughters were going to birthday parties and clubs on nights where there were bombings, and they were acting like it was nothing. And I understand that was the mentality at the time, the whole what stay strong and soldier on idea.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it showed how I said warts and all with Churchill and his family. It showed that
shows the privilege.
The privilege, and they had been so removed from it, and then they were thrown into it, and it's like, yeah, the people you're hanging out with have been dealing it for a year.
Yeah. But even when they were going to these places, even when they were in London and there were bombings, they, along with a lot of the London populace, were just kind of like, if I die, I die. If it hits me, it hits me. If not, I'm
Right.
gonna carry on. Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, and it was kind of like you said, for a long time, the Churchill family and their friends were definitely removed. I mean, he spent his weekends away at a country home, but most politicians, I think, back then spent their weekends away in holiday homes. Even during the war,
they do that.
But they often traveled back into London, for the work week, regardless of bombings or not.
I mean,
and so it's just the idea that and then when they did start experiencing it, then it became real to them. And like you said, yeah, they started realizing this is the reality that everyone had. But unlike a lot of history books that discuss World War II, we actually dive down and get to see little snippets and perspectives of random Londoners in England and what their thoughts were, not just the the grand chess piece of World War II.
Exactly. And it's like these people, they come up, some of them come up regularly in the narrative. Like I know that Virginia Woolf and her secret lover, Vita Sackville, they pop up. A woman by the name of Bonham Carter, who is, if I remember right, related to Helena Bonham Carter, pops up a few times. And then all these diarists show up every once in a while. The same woman I think her name was Olivia, over and over again. She pops up.
Was it Virginia Woolf that was the one that basically she was like, I'm not leaving. I think eventually she did leave London. For a long time though, she didn't leave London.
She left London because she had mental health reasons, and her doctor said, hey, maybe leave the city.
Okay. But before that, she was like laying in her bed with water dripping on her. Her windows were blown out. It was freezing cold. And she was just like, this is my home. I'm not leaving.
Yep. I believe that. Yeah. That's one thing I wanted to say about the, before we moved on to this is about normal Londoners too, but how I was mentioning about Churchill's
eccentricities,
perceived snobbishness and everything, and then it brings us down to the level of normal Londoners, how it's like, this is our life. It also calls into question the mindset at the time, because a lot of the characters, even Churchill, kind of thought that the world was ending, essentially, at that point. Yeah. So it's like a lot of these characters, how you said, well, if I die, I die. I'm going to go out just staying strong, doing what I've always done.
Yeah. Well, the Nazis basically ended the status quo when especially once they took over France.
Right.
It was England and a lot of the Western European countries had always just kind of assumed, in the post of, the aftermath of World War I, that
no more invasions, no more.
That they tried to contain Germany, all of this stuff.
Strong arm occupations, no more.
And so, and a lot of people in World War, at the beginning of World War II were veterans of World War I, and they had been through it and experienced it. And so I think, they see this looming threat, France has crumbled and, they're on their doorstep, basically. If it hadn't been for that experience in World War I, not that I really want to get into historical what ifs, that's not really why we're here to talk about, but It is something to consider. Part of what made Churchill great to a lot of people was how he was able to rally them and give them a fighting spirit. But a lot of those people, I think, probably had the fighting spirit once they realized what was going on.
Right.
Obviously the government knew what was going on with Hitler long before the public did.
Right. And the question was that out of exasperation or was it out of bravery or something like that? Because that's one thing that, as a modern reader, modern audience, is that it would be not difficult, but a challenge to take a modern person and put them into that mindset where it's like, hey, you just got out of one war, you're going into another, and the guy who's bombing you doesn't care about you. He would destroy every single English person on this in the country and then rule over the ashes. So it's like, it's very difficult to put oneself into that mentality.
Yes. And no, keep going. I'm looking for a quote that I had actually written down that goes along with this. That I think
and I mean,
really
to some extent, it's like most authors, and I can understand this entirely, don't really try to an extent, because then you get like the over explanation. Instead it's like, look, just move the narrative forward. The shock and the horror will follow, and, you know, think of the people as you will.
Right.
And it's like, even though, you know, I'm sitting here saying like, well, you know, Churchill's daughters were snobs, they were still very brave. All these people were still incredibly strong.
Oh, it's, I know. You try and put yourself in, like, in the...
Exactly.
Just literally think about what they're doing, where they are, and the mindset that we're reading that they were supposedly in, and I'm just like, yeah, no, not me.
I get it too. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we all just came out of COVID, and it's like, all of us had thoughts like that sometimes. So it's like, gee, I really want to go out to a restaurant, you know, that sort of thing. But anyway.
All right. Well, I can't find the exact quote, but it was something along the lines of, like, you know, we think about the Germans being the one that were, you know, vile and wanted to rain chaos down on Europe and England. And it was someone higher up in the British military said something along the lines of, like, you know, this army is not going to stop for anyone. The only way we're going to stop them is by killing more women and children on their ground than they kill on ours.
I remember
and just
that.
kind of this idea that, like, they thought, like, if we're to preserve what we've built,
we have to destroy,
you know, and
them.
with them and the empire, you know, back then it was truly a global empire. The only way we're going to do it is to kill citizens. You know, that was still a mindset back then. And whether it was the pervading mindset of everyone who was involved in the war and heading the war, I don't know. But that was a quote in the introduction that I found a little, I wasn't expecting it, I guess. Mainly because I've probably, you know, I've learned Western history from an American perspective.
Because I remember, like, my dad always told me this, how you mentioned, and I remember that line. It was on the invasion of Normandy, because America was involved at this point in England, and all the Allies were there. I believe it was the British were willing, I think, to drive over bodies and over fallen soldiers to get to the machine gun nest. The Americans were not.
Oh, yeah.
I believe it. I'm not sure if it's the other way around, but I remember one side had a really hard time, and they refused to do it. They were like, we're not going to drive our tanks over soldiers. We're not going to do it.
Yeah. I would assume, I mean, that sounds American, but I'm American.
Exactly. And also, I mean, if you look at, just like how you said that line, it's like England, and I mean, all of Europe at that point, they knew what the Nazis were, how far the Nazis were willing to go to invade, to take everything, the Third Reich. So they said, we have to match that energy. We have to fight fire with fire. And it's like, America was still somewhat removed from that. And it's like, we had seen the horrors, but like that was before the concentration camps had been found too, which
before we knew about.
This book also takes place before all of that. You see the hints of like Jewish hate in it.
Yeah, there's a little bit of it, but yeah, very little about the Holocaust is mentioned aside from
none of it is basically just like Goring and
just
Goebbels and Hitler saying, like, you know, Jews, you know, that sort of thing, but like little comments off to the side. But no, I remember reading that, and my dad told me that somewhere, and it's, since you said that line, that was the first thing I thought of.
Yeah.
The little aside. Sorry if I keep blathering on, but that was another thing about the book that I found really, really interesting, was how reluctant America was to get involved in this war.
I had known about that. And one of the things that I always think is interesting, and it still happens now, though less so in the modern age, just with advent of the internet and instant communication, is a lot of foreign governments, and especially the English government, didn't really understand how the U.S. Congress worked in relation to the U.S. president. Because there were many times in World War II, and there have been times since then, where, you know, you'll hear British prime ministers or British politicians tell the president, come on, just get it done. Why can't you get your Congress to pass it? And it was like, well, the way our democracy is set up is we don't give our president all that power.
Unilateral power.
It has to be ratified's not the right word, but it has to be approved by a certain percentage of Congress before they can make a law and say that it's okay to do it.
Yep. Which was something else actually about the book that
I was just going to say, and so much of American politics, especially today, and I'm sure back then too, was focused on re-election.
Yes,
so much was electability. So it was like, I don't want to do this. I want to be elected another term. So I don't, you know, maybe it's the right thing to do, maybe it's not, but I don't want to do it because it's
look at
ratings.
Most of the book is devoted to who was the president at the time?
FDR.
FDR. It's like almost the entire book was devoted to his preoccupation with being reelected. That's like about a year's worth of time in the book. And today it's like, okay, so maybe about a year and a half ahead of time. So it's like, yeah, our politics have not changed terribly much between now and then. It's just everything's moved a little bit more radically. But
yeah,
no, that was one thing I remember thinking about the book too when I was reading it about Churchill, was like some of the characters or people, because these aren't characters.
Yeah, these aren't characters.
They kept hinting that like Churchill in some kind of way enjoyed the fact that the country was at war because it gave him a lot of power he would not have had. Like again, this makes him sound so cruel, but he really wasn't. It's just he was the right man for the right job. But it's like he had so much control, and it's like exactly what he always wanted. It's like I can steer England.
Yeah, that's one of the things I watched. In addition to this, I watched
The Darkest Hour.
I watched Darkest Hour with Gary Oldman, and then I also watched there was a 2-part series called The Gathering Storm and Into the Storm, and I watched Into the Storm, which focuses on kind of England and Churchill in World War II, where I think The Gathering Storm is the lead up to World War II. But in both of them, they do take a long focus on the fact that, you know, when Churchill was young, he liked to play with army toys, and he always dreamed of being a military man, and he came into the military, and he saw war as like the man's chess game, basically. And he liked being able to control that, like you said, to move the pieces where he wanted. And so, I mean, good or bad, he enjoyed being at war. He obviously wanted England to be at war, to be in the position they were in, but because they were in it, he relished in it, and he didn't shy away from it. Right.
It's like those, I mean, I don't want to, intrusive thoughts might not be the right word, but it's like something horrible is happening, but at the same time, you find that you're actually pretty good at what needs to be done. So it's like, oh, you're enjoying it, but you're not really enjoying it. It's not a good thing.
Yeah.
That you have to do it.
And both of those films, as well as this book, also put a lot of stress on his wife, and the part she played in trying, whether she was trying to rein him in or give him a push or something like that. You know, they always say, you know, the president runs the country, but, you know, the first lady runs the president.
Yep, and it's the same with the prime minister. And it's like one comparison I kept thinking during the book, especially when, of all things, I read that like Pamela, it was, right, his wife,
Clementine.
Why did I think that Pamela's the daughter?
Pamela's one of the daughters, yeah.
But it's like Clementine and Winston had separate beds. That's exactly what Alfred Hitchcock and his wife Alma had. They had separate beds.
Yeah,
and it's like I kept looking at like. This just sounds so stupid, but it's like I know what Winston Churchill looks like and what he sounds like and everything. Sometimes I kept seeing Alfred Hitchcock because it's like it was the same way. Alma, like Alfred was a genius, flawed genius, but a genius. But Alma was kind of there sometimes to like come in and say like, "Hey, that's a bad idea. Don't do that."
Yeah,
or like do this instead. Like,
and then there's
the exact
Yoko.
Same thing.
Then there's Yoko, but we're not going to talk about Yoko.
We'd like to take a brief moment to thank you for listening to Story Weavers. For the enjoyment of our listeners, we want to keep this podcast ad-free and uninterrupted.
If you would like to support us further, check out our options on Patreon. Plus, subscribing will get you behind-the-scenes content, bloopers, access to Book of the Month polls, and more. We appreciate any and all support.
Now back to the episode.
Is there anything else we want to discuss? I think.
I mean, did we want to talk about humanizing Nazis?
Actually, I think that probably is. I think that's definitely a good. I think it's a point to bring up because it is something that he does.
Everyone's treated with the same level of gravity in this book, and it's like how you said earlier, you jump from the Brits to the Germans, and you kind of go back and forth. And it's like they're both treated the same way, warts and all. Like
in the sense of how they're portrayed in the book, one is not necessarily shown as evil in that he's not using his own adjectives to necessarily describe them that way.
Exactly, because you're not the villain in your own story. You're the villain, but you're always the villain in someone else's. Mm-hmm. And that they take that there's obviously times where you can tell, like, oh, this person's not good. Like, I think it was Goebbels who was the one who was really like anti-Jewish. Like he was the one where even in this book he was like, we have to stamp this problem out as soon as we can. We're starting some of the raids on some of these neighborhoods, stopping them. And it's like you get things like that, which is like, yeah, that's not good. But other times it's like Hitler playing with dogs because he loved dogs or something. Or the one thing I keep remembering is, was it Goring? He had a love for art's sake. And it's like, I remember, like, as an artist, it's like, yeah, that's something that's nice, but not from you.
Yeah,
and not what he was doing.
He pillaged tens of thousands of pieces of art from places, and that was the thing he loved about war, was he got to claim the spoils. It was like it was millennia ago with the Romans or the Spartans, and it was just
or
like
the British.
Or the British, for that matter.
Yeah,
taking over land to steal the art and have it for yourself, which is something I think most cultures like vehemently are against nowadays.
Yes. Well, because besides taking the art, the Nazis were also notorious for one, losing it or hiding it. Like I don't know if it actually has a name, but there's supposedly some train that was buried in some mountain somewhere that's just filled with gold, Nazi gold. Yeah. And no one knows where it is, but it's somewhere.
Right.
And it's just lost to time. And then they also destroyed a ton of stuff. I mean, in this book, they talk about all the landmarks and all the buildings that were destroyed, that are completely demolished in France, England, all over. And I remember I forget the name of it, but it's like this gold room. It was this gold room in a palace in Russia. Mm-hmm. And the Nazis destroyed it. Mm-hmm. And it was like this room that was worth like billions of dollars because it was gold and it was beautiful, jewels everywhere. And they just destroyed it. Yeah. I don't remember what point in the war, but it's like, that's something funny to think about when you hear about how much like, oh my God, I love art because, art's such a beautiful thing. It's like.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. We see Churchill with his family and we see, Goebbels with his family, and he's talking about things he has to do before Christmas comes. It's one of those things that, and to me, that's jarring, but it's almost jarring in a good way. Like it reminds you, like they weren't just sitting, in their offices the entire time plotting out the war. Yeah, they weren't caricatures, which is the way we see them nowadays, especially because a lot of times if you're in a history class, you're given a list of facts. These are things to know about this person.
Right.
But it's a reminder, like these were people with everyday lives, and I'm going to go ahead and say they were horrendous people. I don't think anyone's going to deny that nowadays. I safely
agree with you there.
But the fact that the way Erik Larson presents it is he doesn't have to tell you they're bad people. He presents you with their lives, and then you infer from there.
Exactly. Like what's the one picture of Goebbels that I know of and I clearly remember is what was it, the Eyes of Hate?
With the
I think
stare.
It's called, with the Jewish photographer before and after he found out he was Jewish. And it's like, you don't need to be told this guy is horrible, but he's not spending, like how you said, he's not spending every day, every hour, like plotting at his desk and being like a maniacal villain. He's a human, which when you put it all together makes it somewhat disturbing, but it's also, you're not looking at the big picture. In this book, sometimes you're seeing individual scenes.
Yeah. One of my favorite scenes in the book is actually, I think Churchill and his family and some of his administration were at Chequers, and they're just talking about it was a critical point in the war, and there was a whole lot going on, and everyone was tired and wanted to go to bed, but Churchill did not want to go to bed, and he didn't let anyone go to bed. And so he put on records and started like dancing in his nightgown and regaling people with poems and tales and all of this stuff. And it was, that's a common theme throughout the entire book, is just that even in these times, people still took the time to just live their lives and be happy, because especially when death is at your door, you kind of realize, if I'm not happy now and it ends, I might as well make the best of it.
Right. I mean, that actually calls into question, like, how earlier I kept saying, like, his daughters were spoiled or something. It's like, that's actually a good perspective on it. It's like, were they still a bit naive?
Sure, yes. I'm sure they were.
But it also shows that mentality of, well, if I'm going to go out, I'm going to go out with a smile. Or if I'm going to go out, I'm going to go out doing something that I like, or something that I'm having fun doing. It's like...
Oh, and there's more than one scene in the book. There's numerous scenes in the book of people, whether it was Churchill running to the top of, to the roof of a building to watch, an air battle, or people that would picnic, on a hill and to watch the planes do battle in the air. Like planes were still a new thing back then. A lot of people didn't regularly see planes, and so seeing air battles, even knowing that some of those could be bringing bombs to their village, people were still awed by it.
I mean, let's be honest, even today, I am 100% certain that I would be one of those, like, fools who would, like, if there was something going on outside, like in the sky, like, a firefight or whatever, I'd probably stick my head out and be like, ooh, what's going on, and watch, because it's, like you said, it's not a sight. Yeah. And it's like, if a bomb's going to fall, it's going to fall.
Yeah.
And might as well be like, well, good knowing you. I just thought of this quote from Carrie Fisher. Mm-hmm. This is just a ridiculous quote. It has nothing to do with what we talked about. Someone asked her once, like, how would you want to die? And I think she said, being strangled by my own bra by the light of a full moon. And they printed that as her obituary too in one of the LA magazines, and I was like,
God. Go Carrie.
Yes. But this is exactly like that. It's like, if you're gonna go out enjoying it, or make it worth the space in print.
So I hope everyone who followed along with us and joined and participated as part of the Book of the Month, I hope you enjoyed The Splendid and the Vile by Erik Larson. We had a good time reading it.
It was a great book. Fantastic.
Yeah. We didn't really race. We continually kept up with people, or with each other's progress. But I won. I'm just putting that out there.
This is not shocking. I am a slow reader, everyone. Ironically, I read like a snail.
So that's why we're giving ourselves a month every time to read books, and a lot of our books are not going to be quite as long as Splendid and the Vile.
No. I remember when you said Splendid and the Vile, it's like, I was like, that sounds like a great book, but are you sure? But it was fantastic. I absolutely loved it. It was.
Yeah, I've like I said, I've read In the Garden of Beasts, which is about an American diplomat, ambassador diplomat, who was.
I was actually wondering, was he
in
mentioned
Berlin
in this book?
I don't think so. I don't think. Well, I don't think he. I don't. Well, that book mainly takes place in the 30s. Also,
oh yeah, it takes place.
That book's
just
like 33
okay.
to like 39. It's basically he's the ambassador to Germany, and he's in Berlin, and he basically watches the Nazification of Berlin. Mm-hmm. Yeah, also very interesting and very spine tingling at times. Just how natural, everything seemed to happen.
Yep. Well, no, it's like I've read that book as well, and I could also recommend these two. Dead Wake. That was the first one I read, about the sinking of the Lusitania. Mm-hmm. Very important event in World War I history. It was really what got the U.S. involved in World War I, I'd be tempted to say. Mm-hmm. And the second was The Devil in the White City, which I think it's my
everyone
favorite
tells
Erik
me
Larson
that's
book.
their favorite Erik Larson. I need to read that one. My dad's been harping on me to read that for years.
I know Martin
to get on
Scorsese for a while was supposed to direct an adaptation of it. Leonardo DiCaprio, I think, was supposed to play either one of the people who built the World Fair in Chicago, or one would have played H.H. Holmes, which either way, I mean, that combination, Scorsese and DiCaprio, come on.
Yeah, that'd be great. Make it happen. Make it happen.
Yes. Netflix, I mean, with all the strikes going on, I'm not exactly going to root for stuff, but please.
Yeah.
Please. But no, that book is spine tingling, quite literally. I mean, serial killer and everything, but it's just so fantastic. So if you liked Splendid in the Vial, definitely check out some of Erik Larson's other work.
Yes. And I think we will have announced it by now, probably on a previous episode, but the next book of the month we're going to do is going to be Johnny Got His Gun by Dalton Trumbo. It's a book John's already read, and it's a book that he wants me to read
so much.
And so we've decided to make it our next book of the month. It's significantly shorter than the Splendid in the Vial. Though what it does have in common is it is a war novel, which is not something that is it World War II also
World
specifically?
War I.
It's World War I. Okay. Yeah. And I don't typically read war novels outside of history or nonfiction texts, though I am currently reading Catch-22, which is a war/anti-war novel, depending on how you look at it. So that one's been a lot of fun to read. It's very entertaining, very tongue-in-cheek. So it'll be interesting reading Splendid in the Vial, and then Catch-22, and then Johnny Got His Gun.
You're going to get genre whiplash. Johnny Got His Gun is not at all like Catch-22. It is I will warn you, it is a very heavy book. Very heavy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when for anyone who wants to follow along with our book of the month, Johnny Got His Gun by Dalton Trumbo. We'll have links in descriptions for everything. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Erik Larson's Splendid in the Vial, talking about Churchill during his first few years as Prime Minister during
World War II
and the bombing of London by the Nazis.
Thanks everyone for listening, and until next time, this has been Story Weavers. Thank you for listening to this episode of Story Weavers. As ever, we're incredibly grateful to all of our listeners and contributors. Come back next week for the next installment of Story Weavers.